He kicked the cat out until it entered his son's room. Chapter 1. The Weight of Empty Rooms. The November wind cut through the suburbs of Cedar Falls like a blade, rattling the windows of the two-story colonial house that had once been filled with laughter. David Matthews stood at his kitchen window, watching the orange tabby cat pick through the garbage can he'd knocked over earlier that morning. The sight made his jaw clench, a familiar surge of irritation rising in his chest like bile. "Get out of here," he muttered, rapping his knuckles against the glass. The cat looked up briefly, its green eyes reflecting the porch light, then went back to scavenging with an infuriating calm that made David's blood boil. 6 months. 6 months since the accident, and this damn cat had shown up 3 weeks later like some kind of cosmic joke. His wife Sarah had started feeding it, of course. She'd always been the soft heart in their marriage, the one who brought home injured birds and donated to every animal shelter within 50 miles. Even in her grief, especially in her grief, she'd clung to the idea of caring for something, anything. "It's just temporary," she'd said, setting out a small bowl of kibble by the back door, "until we can find it a proper home." But temporary had stretched into weeks, and weeks had become routine. The cat would appear every evening at dinner time, as if it had internalized the rhythm of their household better than David had managed to do himself. Sarah would slip outside with food and fresh water, sometimes sitting on the back steps to watch it eat, her face carrying the same gentle expression she used to reserve for tucking Tommy into bed. David pushed away from the window and walked to the refrigerator, his bare feet silent on the cold tile floor. The house felt massive around him at 2 in the morning, every room an echo chamber of memories he'd rather forget. He pulled out a beer, his third of the night, and cracked it open with more force than necessary. The living room was exactly as Sarah had left it before she'd gone to stay with her sister in Portland. Her reading glasses still sat folded on the coffee table next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. The throw pillows were arranged just so on the couch where she used to curl up with Tommy for their Saturday morning cartoons, everything preserved like a museum exhibit of a life that no longer existed. David settled into his recliner, the leather worn smooth from years of use, and took a long pull from his beer. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling and the distant hum of the refrigerator. He'd grown to hate the quiet. In the early days after the funeral, people had filled the house with casseroles and condolences, their voices a buffer against the crushing weight of loss. But people moved on, as they always did, returning to their own lives and leaving him alone with grief that felt too big for his body to contain. The cat's plaintive meow drifted through the walls, and David's grip tightened on his beer bottle. He'd asked Sarah to stop feeding it before she left. "We can't keep encouraging it," he'd said, standing in their bedroom doorway as she packed her suitcase with mechanical precision. "It's not our responsibility." She'd looked at him then with eyes that held more disappointment than anger. "When did you become so cruel, David? When did caring about something become such a burden?" He hadn't answered because he didn't know how to explain that caring hurt too much now. That every act of kindness, every gesture of love felt like tempting fate to take something else away from him. The cat represented hope, and hope was a luxury he couldn't afford. Another meow, closer now, probably right outside the kitchen door. David finished his beer and considered going upstairs to bed, but the thought of lying awake in the empty master bedroom, staring at Sarah's untouched pillow, made his chest tight with anxiety. Instead, he got up and walked to the kitchen, flicking on the overhead light. The cat sat on the back porch steps, illuminated by the yellow glow spilling through the glass door. Its fur was matted and dirty, ribs visible beneath its coat despite weeks of Sarah's charity. It looked up at him with those unsettling green eyes, and for a moment David felt something stir in his chest that might have been sympathy. Then he remembered Tommy's voice from that last morning, excited and chattering about the baseball game they were supposed to attend that weekend. He remembered the phone call from the hospital, the words that had shattered his world into before and after. He remembered Sarah's sobs echoing through the house for weeks afterward, and how the sound had made him want to run until his lungs gave out. The sympathy curdled into resentment. This cat, this creature that represented everything soft and vulnerable and ultimately doomed, was asking him to care again, to open his heart to something that could be taken away without warning, without mercy, without any consideration for how much loss one person could bear. David unlocked the back door and yanked it open. The November air rushed in, carrying the scent of dead leaves and winter's promise. The cat looked up at him hopefully, its tail twitching with anticipation. "No more," David said, his voice rough with beer and exhaustion. "No more handouts. Find somewhere else to go." He stepped onto the porch, and the cat scrambled backward, startled by his sudden presence. David felt a sick satisfaction at its fear, even as part of him recoiled at his own cruelty. "You hear me?" he said louder, advancing another step. "Get out of here. This isn't your home." The cat bolted across the yard and disappeared into the darkness beyond the fence line, leaving David alone on the porch with his righteousness and his rage. He stood there for a long moment, breathing the cold air and telling himself he'd done the right thing, the practical thing. As he turned to go back inside, his eyes caught on something that made his breath stick in his throat. There, pressed against the glass of the kitchen window, was a small handprint at child height. The oils from little fingers still faintly visible on the surface. Tommy's mark, left behind from some forgotten morning when he'd stood on tiptoes to watch birds in the backyard. David stared at the handprint until his vision blurred, then quickly looked away and stepped back into the house, locking the door behind him with shaking fingers. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows like fingers tapping to get in. Chapter 2. The Weight of Memories. Morning came grey and bitter, matching David's mood as he nursed his coffee at the kitchen table. His head throbbed from too much beer and too little sleep, but the physical discomfort was preferable to the hollow ache that lived permanently in his chest. Through the window, he could see his neighbour Mrs. Chen tending to her garden, pulling up the last of her autumn flowers before the first hard frost. She waved when she noticed him watching, her weathered face creasing into the kind smile that had greeted his family every morning for the past 8 years. David managed a brief nod in return before turning away. Even simple human kindness felt like sandpaper against his raw nerves these days. The house phone rang, shrill and insistent in the quiet kitchen. David considered letting it go to voicemail, but the caller ID showed Sarah's sister's number in Portland. He picked up on the 4th ring. "David." Melissa's voice was cautious, the way people spoke to him now, as if he might shatter at any moment. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," he lied, the words automatic after months of practice. "How's Sarah?" There was a pause, loaded with the weight of things unsaid. She's thinking about staying here a little longer. Maybe through the holidays." David closed his eyes and pressed his forehead against his palm. The holidays. He'd been trying not to think about Thanksgiving and Christmas, about the empty chair at the table and the unopened presents that would never find their intended recipient. "That's probably for the best," he said, and meant it. The house was a minefield of memories, and Sarah moved through it like someone learning to walk again after a devastating injury. At least in Portland, she could pretend to be healing. "David, she's worried about you. We both are. You can't keep isolating yourself like this." "I'm not isolating. I'm processing." Melissa's sigh carried clearly through the phone. "Processing what? Anger? Because that's all I hear in your voice anymore. You're angry at the world, angry at God, angry at that poor cat Sarah was trying to help." David's grip tightened on the receiver. "She told you about the cat? She's worried you're losing your humanity, along with everything else. When did you become someone who kicks a stray animal into the cold?" The accusation hit deeper than he'd expected. "It's not my responsibility to save every lost thing that wanders into my yard. No one's asking you to save it, but you could show a little compassion. Tommy would have wanted you to take care of it." The mention of his son's name was like a physical blow. David's vision went white around the edges, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. "Don't," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't you dare tell me what Tommy would have wanted. David, I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" He hung up without another word and sat staring at the phone until his hands stopped shaking. Outside, Mrs. Chen was still working in her garden, her movements slow and deliberate as she prepared her plants for winter's death. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of mindless television and intermittent dozing in his recliner. He'd taken indefinite leave from his job at the accounting firm, using up vacation days and sick time, while his colleagues sent carefully worded emails asking when he might be ready to return. The answer was never, but he wasn't ready to face that reality yet. Around noon, he forced himself to shower and drive to the grocery store. The simple act of being around other people felt overwhelming, their normal lives and casual conversations a stark reminder of how far he'd drifted from the world of the living. He moved through the aisles like a ghost, picking up frozen dinners and beer with mechanical efficiency. In the pet food aisle, he stopped without meaning to. A display of cat treats caught his eye, and for a moment he found himself remembering Tommy's excitement the previous spring when they'd found a nest of baby rabbits in their backyard. "Can we keep them, Dad? Please? I'll take care of them, I promise." David had explained about wildlife, about how mother rabbits needed to care for their babies, but Tommy had spent weeks checking on the nest, reporting their progress with the serious dedication of a wildlife researcher. When the babies had finally ventured out on their own, Tommy had been both proud and heartbroken. "I'm glad they're free," he'd said, watching the last one disappear under the garden fence. "But I miss taking care of them." The memory hit David like a punch to the gut, and he quickly pushed his cart away from the pet supplies. At the checkout, the teenage cashier tried to make small talk about the weather, but David responded with monosyllables until the kid gave up and focused on scanning his items with uncomfortable silence. Back home, he put away his groceries and tried to settle back into his routine of television and alcohol-assisted numbness. But Melissa's words kept echoing in his head, mixing with memories of Tommy's voice and Sarah's disappointed eyes. The house felt smaller somehow, the walls pressing in with the weight of his own guilt and grief. As evening approached, he found himself standing at the kitchen window again, looking out at the empty backyard. No sign of the orange tabby, which should have brought him satisfaction. Instead, he felt a strange hollowness, as if he'd accomplished something that ultimately didn't matter. The sun was setting behind the bare branches of the oak tree that Tommy used to climb, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that his son had always found magical. Tommy would have been setting up his telescope right about now, preparing for one of their stargazing sessions on the back deck. He'd been fascinated by astronomy, dreaming of becoming an astronaut or astrophysicist when he grew up. "Dad, look, is that Mars?" Tommy would ask, squinting through the eyepiece with intense concentration. David had bought him books about space, encouraged his curiosity, never imagining that all those dreams would end on a rainy Tuesday morning when a drunk driver ran a red light downtown. The darkness outside was complete now, and David could see his own reflection in the kitchen window, hollow-eyed and gaunt. He looked like a man who'd forgotten how to live, and maybe that was exactly what he'd become. He was about to turn away when a flash of movement caught his eye. There, at the edge of the porch light's reach, he saw the orange tabby crouched beside the garbage cans. It looked thinner than before, its coat matted with what might have been rain or dew. As David watched, the cat looked toward the house with an expression that seemed almost hopeful, as if it still believed in the possibility of kindness. For a moment, something cracked in David's chest. He thought about going outside, about setting out food and water, about choosing compassion over self-protection. But then the moment passed, sealed over by months of practiced numbness, and he turned away from the window without opening the door. The cat would have to find somewhere else to go. He'd made his choice, and he wasn't going to be swayed by sentiment or guilt. Not anymore. Chapter 3. The Breaking Point. 3 days passed in a haze of routine numbness. David had perfected the art of existing without truly living, moving through his empty house like a sleepwalker, going through familiar motions. He ate when hunger became impossible to ignore, showered when his own reflection disgusted him, and spent the rest of his time in the recliner, watching mindless television with the volume turned up just loud enough to drown out his thoughts. The cat hadn't returned, or if it had, David had managed to avoid seeing it. He told himself this was victory, proof that his harsh approach had worked. The creature had finally gotten the message and moved on to find some other soft-hearted family to manipulate with its pitiful appearance. But Tuesday morning brought an unexpected visitor that shattered his carefully constructed isolation. Mrs. Chen stood on his front porch, holding a covered casserole dish and wearing the determined expression of someone who'd run out of patience for polite boundaries. "David, dear, you look terrible," she said when he answered the door, pushing past him into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. "When was the last time you had a proper meal?" He followed her to the kitchen, too surprised by her boldness to protest. Mrs. Chen set the casserole on the counter and began opening cabinets with the familiarity of someone who'd been in the house many times during happier occasions. "Mrs. Chen, you really don't need to—" "Nonsense," she interrupted, pulling plates from the cabinet. "Sarah asked me to check on you before she left, and I've been watching you waste away for weeks. Enough is enough." She heated up portions of what turned out to be her famous beef stew, the same dish she'd brought to every neighborhood potluck for years. The smell filled the kitchen with warmth and comfort that David had forgotten existed, and despite his reluctance, his stomach responded with genuine hunger. They ate in relative silence, Mrs. Chen occasionally making observations about the weather or her grandson's progress in college. It wasn't until they'd finished eating that she turned the conversation in a direction David hadn't expected. "That orange cat has been sleeping in my garden shed," she said, watching his face carefully. "Poor thing is skin and bones. Been crying outside your house every night, but I suppose you already know that." David set down his fork and looked away. "It's not my problem." "No, I suppose it isn't," Mrs. Chen agreed, her tone deceptively mild. "Just like it wasn't your problem when Tommy brought home that injured bird last spring and you helped him nurse it back to health, or when Sarah wanted to foster that litter of puppies from the animal shelter and you built them a pen in the garage." The mention of his son's name made David's chest tight, but Mrs. Chen continued without mercy. "Grief changes people, David. I know that better than most. When my husband died, I wanted to burn down the whole world just to match how I felt inside. But cruelty doesn't heal pain, it just spreads it around like poison." David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the tile floor. "You don't understand what I'm going through, don't I?" Mrs. Chen's voice remained calm, but her eyes flashed with something harder. "My David died in Vietnam 53 years ago. We'd been married 6 months. I understand exactly what it feels like to have your future ripped away without warning." The words hit David like a physical blow. In all the years they'd been neighbors, Mrs. Chen had never mentioned having a husband, let alone losing one to war. He'd assumed she'd always been alone, that her quiet solitude was a choice rather than a consequence. "I'm sorry," he said, the words inadequate but genuine. "I didn't know." "Of course you didn't, because I learned to carry my grief without letting it turn me into someone I couldn't recognize in the mirror." She stood and began clearing the dishes, her movements brisk with purpose. "That cat isn't asking you to replace Tommy, it's just asking for basic kindness. The kind of kindness your son would have shown without thinking twice." David flinched as if she'd slapped him. "Stop, please." But Mrs. Chen wasn't finished. "Tommy used to come over and help me weed my garden. Did you know that? Every Saturday morning he'd knock on my door and ask if I needed help. Never wanted anything in return, just enjoyed being useful. He had the biggest heart I've ever seen in a child." Tears blurred David's vision, and he gripped the edge of the counter to steady himself. Mrs. Chen moved to stand beside him, her voice gentler now, but no less insistent. "He's gone, David. Nothing you do or don't do will bring him back. But the kindness he brought into this world doesn't have to die with him. You can choose to honor his memory, or you can choose to let grief turn you into a stranger." After she left, David sat alone in his kitchen, surrounded by the lingering warmth of her presence and the accusation in her words. The afternoon stretched endlessly ahead of him, filled with the same hollow routine he'd perfected over the past months. But something had shifted, a crack in the armor of numbness he'd built around his heart. As evening fell, he found himself back at the kitchen window, searching the shadows for any sign of orange fur. The backyard was empty except for the wind moving through the bare branches of Tommy's climbing tree. No movement by the garbage cans, no hopeful eyes reflecting the porch light. The cat was gone, probably for good this time. David had gotten what he wanted, what he'd worked so hard to achieve. So why did victory feel so much like loss? That night, he lay awake in bed listening to the house settle around him, every creak and whisper amplified by the silence. Somewhere around 3 in the morning he heard it, a soft, plaintive meowing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He told himself it was his imagination, a manifestation of guilt and exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. But the sound continued, faint but persistent, until he couldn't ignore it anymore. David got up and walked through the house, checking windows and doors, following the ghost of a sound that seemed to move just ahead of him. The meowing grew louder as he approached the staircase, and with a growing sense of dread, he realized it was coming from upstairs, from Tommy's room. David's feet felt leaden as he climbed the stairs, each step bringing him closer to a confrontation he'd spent months avoiding. The door to his son's room had been closed since Sarah left, sealed away like a tomb he wasn't ready to enter. But the meowing was definitely coming from inside, impossible as that seemed. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob, and for a moment he considered turning around and going back to bed, pretending he'd never heard anything. But Mrs. Chen's words echoed in his mind, along with memories of Tommy's voice and Sarah's tears, and he found himself turning the handle with a resignation that felt like surrender. The door swung open on darkness, and David's breath caught in his throat at what he saw. Chapter 4. The Return of Grace. The orange tabby cat lay curled in the exact center of Tommy's bed, its body forming a perfect circle on the Superman comforter that still carried the faint scent of a 9-year-old boy's dreams. Moonlight streamed through the partially open window, illuminating the scene with an ethereal glow that made David's breath catch in his throat. The cat looked up at him with those unsettling green eyes, but there was no fear there now, only a quiet dignity that made David feel suddenly overwhelmingly small. For a long moment, neither moved. David stood frozen in the doorway, his hand still on the doorknob, while the cat regarded him with the patience of something that had learned to wait for kindness in a world that rarely offered it. The room around them was exactly as Tommy had left it. Astronomy posters covering the walls, books about space exploration scattered across the desk, a half-built Lego rocket ship abandoned on the floor where eager fingers had last touched it. "How did you get in here?" David whispered, though the question was rhetorical. The window. Tommy had always complained about the latch being loose, had asked David to fix it dozens of times. Another item on the endless list of things that would never be completed now. The cat didn't answer, of course, just continued to watch him with those knowing eyes. David took a tentative step into the room, and the cat's tail twitched, but it didn't flee. Another step, then another, until he was standing beside the bed where his son used to sleep. Up close, the cat looked even more pitiful than before. Its ribs showed clearly through its matted fur, and there was a raw patch on its left ear that looked like it might be infected. David found himself reaching out before he could stop himself, his fingers hovering inches from the cat's head. "You're hurt," he said softly, and his voice cracked on the words. The cat leaned into his touch when his fingers finally made contact, a rumbling purr starting deep in its chest. The sound was rusty with disuse, as if the creature had almost forgotten how to express contentment. David stroked its fur gently, careful of the wounded ear, and felt something hard and cold in his chest begin to thaw. "Tommy would have taken care of you," he murmured, the words torn from somewhere deep inside him. He would have brought you inside that first night, would have cleaned your wounds and made you a bed by the heater. He never could stand to see anything suffer. The cat's purr grew stronger, vibrating against David's palm like a tiny engine of comfort. It was the first truly peaceful sound the house had heard in months, and David found himself sinking onto the edge of the bed, his legs suddenly too weak to support him. "I miss him so much," he said to the cat, to the empty room, to the universe that had taken his boy away. "I miss him so much I can't breathe sometimes. And I got so angry at you because you reminded me that there's still beauty in the world, still things worth saving, and that felt like a betrayal of his memory." The words poured out of him like water from a broken dam, months of suppressed grief and guilt and rage, finally finding their voice. He told the cat about the baseball game they'd never attended, about the constellation Tommy had been excited to show him that weekend, about the science fair project they'd planned to build together. He talked about Sarah's pain and his own inadequacy, about the way grief had turned him into someone he didn't recognize. The cat listened without judgment, its green eyes reflecting nothing but acceptance and an ancient understanding of loss. When David's words finally ran out, leaving him empty and hollowed out like a shell, the cat stretched one paw to rest against his hand, a gesture so gentle and deliberate that it brought fresh tears to his eyes. "You chose his room," David said wonderfully. "Out of all the places in this house, all the warm spots you could have found, you chose to sleep where he slept, like you knew, like you could still feel him here." He looked around the room with new eyes, seeing not just the artifacts of a life cut short, but the evidence of joy that had once filled this space. Tommy's telescope stood in the corner, waiting for someone to adjust its focus on distant stars. His collection of rocks and minerals glinted on the windowsill, each specimen carefully labeled in 9-year-old handwriting. A stack of library books about marine biology sat on the nightstand, forever due back to a librarian who would never ask for them. He wanted to be a marine biologist when he grew up, David told the cat. Said he was going to discover new species in the deepest parts of the ocean. Last month, he would have turned 10. Sarah and we couldn't even talk about it. Couldn't figure out how to celebrate a birthday for someone who wasn't there to blow out the candles. The cat shifted position, moving closer to David until it was pressed against his leg, offering its small warmth as comfort. The gesture was so reminiscent of how Tommy used to curl up next to him during thunderstorms that David had to close his eyes against a fresh wave of grief. But this time, the grief felt different, cleaner somehow. Less like poison coursing through his veins, and more like the natural ache of love with nowhere to go. Mrs. Chen had been right. Cruelty didn't heal pain, it just spread it around like infection. But kindness, even small acts of kindness toward a stray cat, could be a form of healing, a way to honor Tommy's memory instead of betraying it. David scooped the cat into his arms, surprised by how light it felt, how fragile. The cat didn't resist, just settled against his chest with a trust that made his throat tight with emotion. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's get you some food and water. And I think there's a first aid kit in the bathroom for that ear." He carried the cat downstairs, flicking on lights as he went and bringing life back to the spaces that had sat in darkness for too long. In the kitchen, he opened a can of tuna and filled a bowl with fresh water, setting both on the floor near the back door. The cat ate with desperate hunger, pausing occasionally to look up at David as if to make sure he was still there, still committed to this act of charity. While the cat ate, David found the first aid kit and gently cleaned the infected ear, murmuring reassurances when the cat flinched at his touch. It was the first time in months that he'd focused on something outside his own pain, and he was surprised by how natural it felt to be caring for another living thing again. "You need a name," he said, as he applied antibiotic ointment to the wound. The cat looked up at him with food still clinging to its whiskers, and David found himself almost smiling for the first time since the accident. Tommy always named everything he found. "He would have had a name picked out for you within 5 minutes," He thought about what Tommy might have chosen, remembering his son's love of space and adventure stories. "How about Cosmos?" he said finally. Tommy would have liked that. Said it meant the whole universe, everything that ever was or could be. The newly christened Cosmos finished eating and began grooming himself with the methodical precision of a creature that had learned self-reliance the hard way. David watched him work, feeling something like peace settle over him for the first time in months. Outside, dawn was beginning to paint the eastern sky with subtle shades of pink and gold. A new day was starting, the first in a very long time that David was actually looking forward to seeing. He had calls to make, to Sarah, to apologize and ask her to come home, to his boss, to discuss returning to work, to Mrs. Chen, to thank her for the hard truths she'd forced him to hear. But first, he was going to sit here in his kitchen with a rescued cat named Cosmos and remember what it felt like to believe in second chances. Tommy would have approved, he thought. His son had always believed in the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds, and maybe it was time for David to start believing in that possibility again, too. As the morning light grew stronger, Cosmos finished his grooming and padded over to David, jumping up onto his lap with the confidence of a cat who knew he was finally home. David stroked his fur gently, careful of the bandaged ear, and for the first time since the accident, he felt something that might eventually grow into happiness. The house didn't feel quite so empty anymore. There was still grief, there would always be grief, but now there was also hope. And sometimes, David thought as Cosmos purred against his chest, hope was enough to start rebuilding a life worth living.